It's so common that we hear about endocrine disruptors, and what's uncommon is that there is no true, clear guidelines and support around it. What is unfortunate is that the FDA continues to allow um, hormone disruptors, endocrine disruptors, toxins into our system. In a study published as far back as 2010, so 13 years ago, it looked at umbilical cord blood. And I'm an obstetrician, and I always say that the safest place in the world to be is inside a mother's womb. It is the absolute safest place. However, recognizing that in this study of analysis of umbilical cord blood, they found over 267 chemicals. 180 something of them were known to be toxins, hormone disruptors, and even carcinogens under those categories. And that's frightening. It's estimated that by the time we leave the house in the morning, a woman on average has put on over 100 chemicals onto her body. If you look at all the many ingredients, and there are some that are common disruptors that we do have to start avoiding. And so we're going to talk about that today to kind of clear up the confusion, to set forth some guidelines, and to support you on your journey to have clean living, right? To be empowered, to have a physiology that's resilient to cancer, that, inflammation, what's that? Mood swings, what's that? I mean, hormone disruptors affect us in so many ways. And I always joke, my daughter, Ava, who's a teenager now, she goes, Mom, you know, my girlfriends all have problems with their periods. I don't have any problems with mine. I'm thinking to myself, well, yeah, I can kind of tell when your period's coming, and that's when I'm handing you those smoothies and an extra shot of Mighty Maca before you walk out the door. But I'm really like focusing on eating at home more and all of that. Definitely motivated to keep hormone balance. Hey, with 4 daughters, I got to keep hormone balance in the household. And so it's true. And now with a granddaughter in my house, like I am so conscientious. What are we putting on her skin? What's going in her body? What is the research behind the recommendation? And very passionate about that, as my daughter is, as my daughter is very clear on what she wants her baby to have and not have. So including organic food and a grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and to learn about these things and how our legislation has downplayed the importance of whole food, real food, and makes growers, organic growers, and grass-fed farmers, regenerative farmers, have to jump through hoops to identify their products in this way, when apparently now legislation was passed that if a cow has been, or an animal has been 1 day eating grass, that is a grass-fed animal. So therein lies your confusion as a shopper. I completely get it, because I didn't realize that too. I'm like, oh, grass fed, great. But those guidelines have been smudged for profit, smudged for legislation, smudged for political agendas, all of these things. And it's really not fair to you, the consumer, and it's not fair to our legacy, our unborn children or our unborn grandchildren. And so today I'm bringing you Lara Adler, and she is an environmental toxins expert and an educator and a certified holistic health coach who teaches health professionals of all types and individuals with health-based businesses to better understand the role of environmental chemical exposures in causing or contributing to chronic health issues, so that they can more comprehensively support their clients and patients that they serve. So she combines environmental health education and business consulting, and she helps people around the world. Her Instagram is Environmental Toxins Nerd. Environmental Toxins Nerd. So, from a place of high admiration for what she does, I want to introduce you today to Lara Adler. Here we go. Well, welcome, Lara, to the Girlfriend Doctor Show.
Thank you for having me. I am excited to get a little nerdy with you.
Me too. I love it. So, well, what brought you to be so passionate about environmental toxins? Is there a personal story that you can share with us?
There actually isn't. It's kind of funny. I think a lot of people come to the health space, to doing work in this space because they had their own health challenge. I actually didn't have that. I was always interested in food and nutrition and health from an early age. I had, was vegetarian and then vegan, and I'm neither of those things anymore, but I was for many, many years, and that sort of pulled me into learning about food and nutrition and farming and the, agribusiness and CAFOs and all of that, and was really fascinated by that.
You said CAFOs. What is CAFOs?
That is a concentrated animal feeding operation. So those big feedlots for, cattle and pigs, and the pollution that is produced by those, that pollute groundwater, that pollute the air in the communities, where those operations exist. It's like the complete opposite of regenerative farming.
Complete opposite. So true, right? The
Yeah,
feedlots and the mills and the dairy barns and the chicken pens. So
yeah,
I got a visual for that. Thank you.
yes,
Now you
exactly.
also said you're no longer vegan, vegetarian. Tell me about that.
I was vegan for almost 20 years. I was vegan for 18 years, and I really thought it worked for me. And, I didn't actually do it for health reasons. I did it exclusively for ethical reasons initially. I started to see a lot of, there was actually two things that kind of turned me away from that. The first, I think, was really seeing a lot of the kind of vitriol and anger and animosity and just really terrible behavior of people in the vegan community that I was surrounded by at the time. I remember in my early days of doing health coaching, I was living in New York City. I had a nutrition blog, I had a food blog, and I was writing about seasonal eating. And even though I was vegan at the time, I was still talking about animal foods, and that there's a seasonality to, the harvesting is not the right word. I haven't had this conversation in so long. So, but there's a seasonality to meat, to animal foods. And I was doing a talk, and it was public, and I had people that were threatening me, that were showing up at the back of my talk, standing there with their arms crossed, glaring at me, and it felt really unsafe. And I was like, how is this okay? And then it was actually reading about, I was really into baking, and all of the vegan cookbooks at the time were using earth balance margarine, which was super popular at the time. Yep,
Oh,
huge in the margarine space. And I was learning, as I was in nutrition school, of health coaching school, all about margarine, which I had never given thought to before.
the
And
things we did thinking they were going to be
oh,
better for
of
us. Oh my
course, of
gosh, right?
course. And I honestly, there wasn't even like, yes, sure, the health aspects of margarine, yes, that caught my attention. But at the time, the thing that really caught my attention was that margarine is often made using palm oil, and palm oil production is the primary cause of habitat destruction for orangutans in the wild. And I kept going, well, how is that vegan? Like, literally, it doesn't actually have animal products in it, but it is destroying the habitat of endangered animals in the wild. And so I kind of was thinking, earth balance according to whom? Like, literally. And so I wrote about how I thought grass fed, pastured butter was more quote unquote vegan than margarine. And I had people threatening me. It was so violent. It was the first time on the internet that I'd been sort of in the crosshairs of people's aggression. And it was scary. And I just was like, you know what? I just can't be part of this community. This is an incredibly myopic, a very privileged view of the world. I've traveled all over the world. I've had that privilege in my life. And I've been to, developing countries. I've seen, people with elephantitis begging on the streets of India. I've been to open air abattoirs in China. I've seen how people live around the world. And like I said, it's an incredibly privileged perspective. But I think the view or the lens of veganism in developed countries, in particularly the United States, is that this is the best way to eat. And I think that that erases the cultural importance of food, the economic access of people. Not everybody can afford, not everybody wants to eat that way. And all of these things together kind of turned me away from that. And then, I kind of tiptoed my way in back to eating animal foods. And now, I regularly eat animal foods and I feel better for it. I had lots of blood sugar issues when I was vegan. Yeah, so that was sort of my journey into this, away from being vegan.
Well, it's important to talk about because there's many, again, there are so many camps. People get into a camp. I will say you get into the keto camp, you get into the
Oh,
paleo
yeah.
camp, you get into the vegan camp or
Yes.
vegetarian camp. So my last book is called Menu Pause. And I always say there's magic in the pauses of our lives. But there are 5 different menu plans that each pause something. And one of them is a vegan plan because oftentimes our vegan vegetarians don't get enough protein, number one, and they're getting way too many carbs. So they're, maybe drinking and eating the best fruits and vegetables, but their blood sugar's through the roof. And I've treated them as diabetics and with
Yeah.
significant hormone balance and muscle issues and osteoporotic issues. I mean, the consequences to everything, if like, and like to have that, uh, you know, perspective that doesn't innately listen to what your body is wanting you to
Yeah.
do or what it's asking for you to do. And there are and there other reason that I put vegan plan is there in there because many people never take a break in eating meat. And we
Sure.
need to take a break in eating meat. We need to give our body a rest. We need to feed and promote healthy, diverse microbiome and challenge them. And I think this, I'm an obstetrician, so I like to give obstetric analogies every once in a while. And this one comes up because as a resident at Grady Hospital in Atlanta, downtown, it was the inner city hospital. And today, it's one of the best training centers for physicians. And so I noticed as a first year resident doing obstetrics, I'm like, gosh, these crack cocaine babies have APGAR scores of 10 out of 10. Like I never get those 10 out of 10 at the Emory Hospital or one of the Piedmont Hospital. I mean, there or our moms that are drug free and have been on bed rest or whatever, those babies sometimes have lower APGAR scores. Like, what's going on here? And the attending physician said it's because it's stress physiology. When you have that stress physiology, they're more robust, they're more adaptable. I mean, they come out shouting their heads off and like ready to take charge in the world. They've been, so I don't, consequences later on. I am not promoting
Sure. Yeah.
cocaine in pregnancy. Let me be really
No.
clear. I am
Yeah.
not promoting that. But, but what was interesting is, I mean, it was just an interesting thing. So we think about that for our gut microbiome. I mean, and I talked to Dave Asprey about this and we get into arguments, but he's like, okay, the natural, um, uh, uh, propensity of humans is to be lazy, right? We are naturally lazy human beings. So that's every part of us. Our gut's going to get lazy and it's going to, like want what's familiar and what's regular. And then you get less diversity. The more diverse gut microbiome we have, the stronger immune system we have, the more resilience we have as individuals. And that's true. Like to say this is the one way. I mean, there are populations culturally diverse populations and ways of eating around the world, food that's been developed regionally. And we look at that for ourselves and learn that. I created my product, Mighty Maca, organic Peruvian maca. Key is Peruvian maca because Chinese maca is not the same thing.
Yeah.
Grown in a different area, same name of a food, completely different. And going back to, and I just come off, I was a vegetarian for many years as well from age 15 till about age 30-ish, and switched from a pure vegan to very quickly to a lacto-ovo, not knowing I had dairy sensitivity. Then every once in a while having some fish, but avoided red meat, white meat for many, many years. And I had the hardest time losing weight. I had hardest time maintaining muscle, and and I thought I could have salad and dessert and I'd be good.
Not
So
so.
no, there's no, and I was a med student at the time, up and through my years of medical school at the time. And then I started eating meat. I mean, I just wasn't as healthy as I could be. And plus, um, my body was really, really craving it. So I think just again, listening, there's a time and a space for everything, and there's a right way and a wrong way. And so in my books, I try to show a right way and that all of us should take a break in eating meat. And I just came from the conference in Austin called KetoCon. So it's definitely a very meat centric conference. And we had a lovely panel of regenerative farmers who talked about, what I alluded to in the introduction, that all grass-fed beef are not the same. But yet they can put that label on there because the FDA lifted any requirement of lifespan being grass-fed, or to the exclusion of grain, grain-fed. So they can be grain-fed their whole life and then be put out to pasture for a day, and there's a grass-fed animal. Um, Again, as consumers, we have to keep voting with our dollar, with our consumer spend. So, talk about the difference between regenerative farming and.
Well, I mean, I can summarize it, but it's definitely not my area of expertise. But regenerative farming is essentially trying to. I look at it as the leave no trace method, or let's leave the place better than we found it. Is that kind of a steward of the earth? So regenerative farming really does take into account inputs. It's minimizing or eliminating things like pesticides, which is the area that I'm have more sort of information on. And it's really trying to mirror the natural behaviors of animals as ruminants and eating grass and being outside, and and to look at that animal products through the toxicity lens. This is a challenging conversation because it's not something that we can ever fully escape, because a lot of the toxics that are in our environment, in particular the highly persistent ones that are legacy chemicals or that have an incredibly long half-life, that are very fat soluble, those are going to be present in all animal foods, regardless of whether or not they are farmed using raised using regenerative practices, or all 100% grass-fed, because these chemicals are just in our environment. However, the animals that are raised in that more concentrated, the CAFO, the feedlot style, they have less activity. They are fed foods that are not natural to them, corn, soy, etc. And so they have a higher fat content, and that higher fat content is where a lot of those toxic chemicals live. So if we're looking at trying to minimize our exposure to toxics, at least that we're bringing in via our food, although both will still have some of these chemicals, it stands to reason, and I don't know how much research there is about the differences between, a standard meat and a regeneratively farmed meat, in terms of things like PCBs or dioxin levels. But I would imagine that the levels would be less, simply because there's actual less fat deposition in those animals, because of their diet and the way that they're raised. And so I always have a little bit of concern about folks that are doing carnivore diet or hard keto diet that has a lot of animal fats in it, because there is risk of higher levels of exposure to some of these more toxic compounds. I remember having a conversation with someone years ago, and their sort of go-to was sardines. They're like, I eat 2 cans of sardines a day, which I don't actually like sardines, so that was gross for me to hear. I was like, well, but And I asked him, I was like, where do your sardines come from? And he's like, well, I don't know. And I said, well, you should probably find out because sardines are very high in fat. And that's great. It's good fat. It's fat that we want. However, some sardines, because of the region in which those fish live and swim, have really high levels of PCBs. And so what's the trade-off? PCBs are incredibly toxic. And so there's a balance here in this conversation that really is pervasive through all aspects, whether it's, we were talking earlier about sunscreen or water contamination. Like there's so many layers to this conversation, and it's never black and white, and it's never a hard prescription or prescriptive approach. We just do the best that we can.
Let's talk about some of those. So, first of all, PCBs, what are they and what are they found in?
PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls. It's a large class of hundreds of compounds. They are on the Stockholm Convention list of, highly toxic, highly persistent chemicals that are banned. They are no longer produced. They used to be used in refrigerators and electrical equipment. They were phased out of use in the 1970s because of their toxicity. However, they're highly, highly persistent. That means that they don't break down. They build up in adipose tissue, in fat tissue, in our bodies, in animal bodies. And so they are still present. They are still being measured. The levels have started to slowly kind of decrease over time, but they are still present. Many of them are carcinogens, many of them are endocrine disrupting, and our primary source of exposure to PCBs is through animal foods. It's through high fat foods, things like butter and cheese, because those are concentrated sources of fat. So, this is the complicated side of the conversation, right? So we were talking earlier before we started recording about what are the things that people can do to reduce exposures. PCBs is a tricky one because they are just there. If you eat seafood, which is in a lot of instances can be incredibly healthy, it's a sustenance food for a lot of communities around the world, and those can be high in PCBs. So it's always a yes and in this
So, how do
conversation.
you clear them from our system? How do we clear
That's
them from our fat? How do we help
uh,
remove them?
yeah, so that's actually quite challenging. I think um, I'll say it this way, and then maybe we can steer the conversation to things that actually have easier solutions, because I think this side of the conversation tends to be overwhelming for people. So PCBs are something that are hard to get rid of in our bodies. It requires, generally speaking, working with a licensed medical professional who understands detoxification and who understands the appropriate methods used and supplements and tools used to remove these chemicals from the body. Sauna can be helpful for some types of PCBs. It's not going to get rid of all PCBs, but if we have sort of subcutaneous fat that has some of these compounds, that's right under the surface of the skin, that's the fat that's going to break down a little bit during sweating for sauna. So, sauna is indicated for people that have PCB exposures, really high PCB exposures, which has been used in assassination attempts, interestingly, poisoning of I think of some Russian diplomat or operative or something. I'm not remember the specifics of this particular case of somebody who was given a high dose of PCB exposure as an assassination attempt. He had to, this is actually an interesting story. He was given a type of fat called olestra.
Mm-hmm.
Olestra is, if you remember, this kind of came out in I think the early
The
2000s, late
Lay's
90s.
potato chips with
Lay's,
Olestra and
yes, they were in Lay's potato chips, and they were marketed as a type of fat or a type of oil that it didn't gain any weight, and the molecule of olestra was actually too large for our digestive system to absorb. So they were like, "Oh, you can eat as many as you want, and you're not actually absorbing any of this fat." And that was the marketing hook. The problem is that it moves so quickly through the digestive system that it would result in anal leakage is the terminology. So like you would just leak oil and fecal matter out of your backside. Really unpleasant side effect of a potato chip. Literally not worth it. However, these olesters also happen to be really good at grabbing onto some of these PCBs and exiting them out of the body. And so that was actually the intervention for this highly toxic amount of PCB exposure was part of the treatment plan.
Oh, wow, that's fun. That's
Oh,
amazing.
pretty interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely would think activated charcoal, high spirulina, chlorella, phase one and phase two detoxification support, all of that
Maybe
together.
yeah, I mean those things can help. I think the hard part with fat soluble toxins is they often get recirculated, so they enter that enterohepatic recirculation process. So they're easily reabsorbed back into the body because the body doesn't. It's when you're losing weight. This is a really common thing that happens. Is this? It's suggested there's some research that suggests that the yo-yo weight coming on and coming off may be a product of toxicity that is now recirculating back into the system. They're fat soluble. There's some research that suggests that this is a defensive mechanism by the body to sequester these fat soluble toxins in adipose tissue so they're not getting into your brain and your other sort of primary organs. Right. And so if you have all of these fat soluble chemicals and you've lost weight, the body's going, well, shoot, we better pump out some more fat cells to go, grab onto those toxins and keep them out of circulation. So it's, that's
Oh,
just
that's so terrible. But definitely, I mean, that's what we'd say obesogens, right? These are
yes.
obesogens, and now we have a whole category of them that are multiple. So PCBs are one of them. What are some of like? How do you get rid of like a couple of the other ones that I certainly know of are the phthalates and parabens.
Yeah.
So
So
in
those
our
actually,
cosmetics, in our plastic bottles, if we're
yes.
drinking out of plastic, we're going to get phthalates. And so let's talk about the very common toxins that we do have remedies. It's still
Yeah,
hard, but
so the you can look at environmental chemicals as kind of falling into, are they persistent or non-persistent? So PCBs persistent, PFAS chemicals, the non-stick chemicals, water resistant chemicals persistent. Things like bisphenols,
okay. So
phthalates.
PFAS, you said that's Teflon, right?
Yes, well, so Teflon is a brand name. Teflon is like Kleenex is tissues, so it's just a trademark name, but it's the primary one manufactured by DuPont. They're one of the companies that sort of pioneered this technology, which is why we all say Teflon when we're talking about nonstick. But there's lots of nonstick coatings that aren't Teflon. But yes, this nonstick coatings, they're pervasive. They're used in tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of applications in consumer products. They are persistent as a class. They don't break down, or they break down incredibly slowly. They're linked to a long list of health effects. They are harder to deal with. That is a challenge. That is our sort of generation's DDT. We're going to be dealing with it for the rest of our lives, our kids' lives, our grandkids' lives. It's here. But when we are talking about things like BPA or parabens or phthalates, which we are also exposed to and are also used in thousands of places, those chemicals are not persistent. They don't build up in the body. So we actually don't need to, quote, detox them. We don't need to do sauna therapy. We don't need to take any supplements. We don't need to do anything. What we need to do is minimize the exposure that we are getting. So oftentimes people like to use the bucket analogy, and the half-life of these non-persistent chemicals in the body is like 6 to 12 hours. So like within a day, our bodies can actually metabolize and we just pee these chemicals out. Now that's not to say that, oh, I can just pee it out, means that it's okay that we're being exposed, because even in the short amount of time that they are in the body, there is enough research now that shows that they're causing problems. Additionally, So CDC does human biomonitoring studies through NHANES. They look for chemical metabolites in urine, in blood, in serum, in breast milk, semen, even across population, right?
Mm-hmm.
And NHANES has found metabolites of bisphenols in, I think, 93% of the population, phthalates in around 98% of the population. And I don't know what the number was for parabens, but consistently almost everyone. And the reason for that is likely not because they're not persistent, but because we're being exposed to them constantly every day. And so, given no new exposures, we can lower the levels in our body or reduce the levels in our body significantly because our body's going to pee them out anyway. But if we're adding, I always think of it like the I Love Lucy clip of the chocolates on the conveyor belt,
Oh yeah, I love that one. Of
right?
my
Like she
favorites.
can't keep up. They're coming in. She's shoving them in her shirt. She's putting them in her mouth, right? Like they're coming in faster. So no amount of her eating them or hiding them is going to stop them coming in. And so the solution to the I Love Lucy problem is to stop the conveyor belt. That's it, right? Like that is what the goal is. And we actually have good research that shows that when people swap out their personal care products or, change their diet, for example, those levels will drop significantly in like within a 3 to 5 day, 3 to 7 day time period, really, really quickly. Why? Because they're not persistent and our bodies can process them out. So that is our intervention, right? It's not a detox.
Great.
It's not a supplement. It's a behavior change. And that can be challenging for people because it's, we have, oh, this is the laundry detergent that I've used for my whole life and I don't want to change it. And okay, so it's more of a psychological shift and a mental shift than it is doing a physical intervention.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's so true. And then the pesticides and herbicides.
Well, they fall
So,
into that same category. They're non-persistent, right? So most pesticides, in the 1970s, we phased out of using organochlorine pesticides. That was DDT, right? Falls into that category. Those were phased out because they were so persistent. And so we switched to a different class of pesticides that had less persistence. That's organophosphate pesticides, which is what we primarily use now. Those are less persistent. They're not less toxic, they're just less persistent. They're differently toxic.
mm,
And so, there are at least 6 or 7 studies, they're diet intervention studies that have looked at both in adults and in children that say what happens when we switch from a conventional diet to a mostly organic diet, not 100% because that's hard. And what they see is metabolites of these pesticides in the urine drop between 80 to 90%
nice,
in 3 to 5 days. Three
nice.
to five days.
Yeah, clarifying, so important. And then in like we touched on and mentioned too the sunscreens, the
Yes.
sun protection. Like there are certain chemicals in sunscreens that are known carcinogens. So do you know those chemicals offhand?
The primary ones that are used in chemical, so there's two kind of categories of sunscreens, chemical sunscreens and physical sunscreens. So technically they're all chemical, right? Because everything's a chemical. So I hate that name. It confuses people. But the chemical sunscreens primarily are using oxybenzone, octinoxate, avobenzone. These are what they're using as a primary means to absorb UV rays. And, there's oxybenzone in particular is linked to endocrine disruption. It's a suspected endocrine disruptor. It's linked to skin allergies and skin sensitization. It's also linked to Hirschsprung's disease, which I don't know from your OB days if that's something that's familiar to you, but it's a congenital birth defect where, if I'm remembering correctly, the intestines are not fully formed in utero, and so it requires surgical intervention immediately because the intestines are just leaking out into the body.
I didn't realize that was connected to these oxybenzoate.
Oxybenzone in particular, benzophenone is the other, it's often called
Okay.
benzophenone 3, or I think is the number. And so, you know, these are we have alternatives, like we have options, right? And so this is where, yeah, okay, so most conventional sunscreens in the United States, in Europe, there's way more sunscreen chemicals that are approved for use. I think there's around like 27. In the United States, there's 8. And it's been 8 for decades. And the EPA, the FDA, because sunscreen is considered a drug because it has an effect, and it's regulated as such. The FDA has not approved any of these European ingredients for inclusion in the US marketplace, and they say it's because they don't have enough research. It's like, yeah, but the EU takes a much harder look at these things.
Right.
Can you not just rely on their research? Why is the ego of like, well, we have to do our own USA research? And it's just so silly. And so we don't have great options in the marketplace in the United States. We have these chemical sunscreens, oxybenzone, octinoxate, avobenzone. There's a couple of other ones. In the chemical category. And then in the mineral physical category, we have like mineral sunscreens, which is primarily just zinc oxide. There's titanium dioxide. There's some question in the EU about endocrine disruption with titanium dioxide in powder form. So I just tend to move away from titanium dioxide. But zinc oxide does not have endocrine disrupting effects. It does not have health effects. The molecule of zinc is too large to pass through the skin, which is why it has that white cast, right? It's a physical barrier between the UV rays and your skin. And it's why people don't like those sunscreens, right? Because they leave a white cast. Now, I will tell you, I actually have sunscreen on today, right now, because I live in the desert and I go out in the morning and I will burn in 5 minutes because I'm fair skinned and a redhead. So
Well, there's definitely a different here. Sunscreen, no sunscreen. Believers. I definitely, if I'm going to be out for a long time, I will put on some sunscreen after a little bit. But typically, it's a hat, it's a light shirt or a
yep,
shawl, something like that to create a barrier, but to still get so my Middle Eastern blood. I'm Middle
yes,
Eastern and Portuguese, so
oh
I
yeah,
need the sun, especially after a long winter. And but I look at really good brands and that are clean. And with the zinc oxide, I mean, it's a few ingredients, and we've come so far in creating really beautiful sunscreens that
yeah,
don't give you that white reflective glow, and because they're doing it in microparticles, they've
yeah.
figured
They've
out great
made them
ways to
smaller.
get them to be good barriers, and other great skin barriers too. So definitely check your health food store, because that's typically a good place. Look for any ingredients that say oxybenzene in a pinch. If you have to use something, better than getting a sunburn. But
Yeah, yes.
ideally, you want to avoid those on a regular basis and look at what's in your skincare. Um, look at what's in your skincare. I had a med spa, so wrinkles, sunspots, aging are really big issues. But that's one of the reasons my balance cream has tripeptide and other essential oils, because you won't get those sunscreens. I've been a sun worshiper all my life. I don't have sunspots on my
Yeah,
chest, on my face, and periodically, it's been about 3 years, but in intense pulse light IPL therapy for women out there that know, I have to schedule one eventually. But because the balance cream got rid of sunspots, that's a really
yeah.
good thing. Vitamins, nutrients, antioxidants, that's supportive too. But don't, like we don't want to burn. It's painful, but we do want the benefit of the sun without the risk or
Yeah,
side
it's
effects.
a balance. You know, I also have seen a lot of people in the kind of wellness space or non-toxic space kind of want to DIY their sunscreen. Like, I can make that at home. I actually don't recommend that at all. Even though technically it's possible, I really don't recommend people do that, because the formulations of these sunscreens are formulated so that the application is really consistent. If you're DIYing it, you're not these, you can DIY, laundry detergent, and you can DIY a moisturizer. But for something like a sunscreen, I really do recommend people not DIY this. Because the risk of skin cancer, it's the number one skin cancer, or number one type of cancer in the United States is skin cancer.
Yeah, and I think
Um,
too, like I think the marketing, like, sunglasses, even for dark skinned people, they
yeah,
feel like they have to put on sunscreen too. I'm like, please honor the intelligence of your body. And I would just say, because the FDA regulation, there are some really, really amazing brands out there that don't put sunscreen on it, because you can't call it a sunscreen unless you have FDA clearance. And I can tell you that is really, really expensive to get. I mean, for a
sure,
small
yeah,
business, it's prohibitive to get.
yeah.
So you can, like, I think Primal Life Organics, actually the maker of Hint Water, Cara, created a sunscreen product that can be used. Anne Marie Gianni. I mean, I used Native while I was away, and another one that I got at forget the name of it right now. But there's some, again, good brands to look at, and
Yeah.
especially when we're putting things on our children. But remember, a light wrap. I mean, in the Middle East, they wore, very loose cotton garbs and head protection. But after a while, let's
And
get the
I think
benefits
also
of it.
that the amount or percentage of the active ingredients, the zinc oxide, needs to be enough. So 15% at a minimum. There are some that have 20, 25% as a, or 23%, I think is the highest I've seen. But I remember years ago, I went to Hawaii to visit a friend. I bought a, not non-toxic natural sunscreen that was a spray, and I didn't, this was years ago, and this is before I started doing this work, but so I knew less at then. And it had a really, really low amount of zinc oxide in it, and it was spray application,
Yeah,
and I
go for it.
burned to a crisp on my first day.
Ah,
I was in so much pain. I had to go the following day to a surf shop to buy a long sleeve rash guard, and I wore that shirt the entire rest of my trip because I couldn't tolerate any sun exposure.
that's
Um,
terrible.
yeah,
That was
I literally,
that
I'm
was
like,
me. That was me 2 years ago in Cabo. I fell asleep after having a couple of glasses of tequila on
we'll do it.
the lounge chair. That totally different reason I burned,
Yeah,
but yeah, even I burned. So Lara,
yeah, and
thank
then
you. I wish we could talk more and more. There's so much more, but I think number one,
yeah,
alleviating the fear of what our bodies can get rid of, recognizing that we do have to legislate to prohibit these legacy toxins. I mean, they're legacy toxins because they persist for generations. We know up to 7 generations. And that is harming and genetically modifying the genetic expression and epigenetic expression of our bodies, of our youth, of our unborn children. So we have to stop that, because there are many of these that are persistent, and
yeah,
the complications, ramifications of which are still being uncovered. And I think and oftentimes, like, I didn't know about Hirschsprung's, like, had a environmental connection, and it's critical. What about autism? What about, the list goes on. So, looking at these things, being active for ourselves, being politically active, voting with our dollars every time that we can to the best of our ability, growing what we can, so cooking at home what you can, so what you put in your food and on your food is important too. So the little things that we can do on a regular basis are really powerful. Now, our audience can find you and your information on Instagram at the Environmental Toxins Nerd. Great site, by the way. And your website is Lara Adler, LARAADLER.com. You've got great stuff there, including checklist, free stuff, information, blogs, podcasts, and you are definitely a wealth of information. And I love to give the website ewg.org/skin deep to look at your products. I make my kids look at their products and make that choice. Like, if you want something, you love that, that CoverGirl, concealer. I'm like, go buy that CoverGirl concealer. But look on, ewg.org/skin deep, and And what is that rated? I need to know that before you buy the product. Anything for me, it's like with kids, anything greater than 1 or 2, you can't buy it. So, and I think it's really important it's to set some guidelines and just awareness, and to take away the fear. Is there any final comment you want to share with our audience, Lara?
Just that we do the best that we can, right? That we're never going to get to zero. That's actually not the goal. The goal is just to minimize exposure in the places that we can. Stress is also toxic. So we really do have to balance taking this information in and taking action. And, I really just am kind of a cheerleader for doing whatever you can. And that's going to be different for everybody.
Yeah. And I think coming from this, what I want my audience to go away with is just what's your one next right step? What's the one next right step that you can do for you, that you can do for your family? Is there one change you can make? Maybe it's on a monthly basis or a
Yeah.
weekly basis or a daily basis. What's the one change that you can make that can really decrease that toxic burden on your life and your family's life? And respond. Let me know what it is. You guys, thank you for being in the Girlfriend Doctor community. Thank you for listening to this show. Your reviews matter. So, wherever you're listening to this podcast, please leave a 5-star review. I appreciate that so much. It helps us raise in rankings in the websites, iTunes, Spotify, Podcast Addict, wherever you're listening, and appreciate that. Share this episode with good faith and friendship to your girlfriends out there as well, friends and family. So much information in here that we just need to bring awareness to. Thank you guys for being here. Till next time.